Randy is a good friend of mine and a man that I look up to in my personal life, and so I don't want to step on his toes, so I'm going to let him explain who he is. But I love you, brother. Thank you so much for being here.
Good evening, Abundant Life Church. It is wonderful to be here. What do you think of this sweatshirt? Got grief. What do you think? My wife hates this sweatshirt. She despises when I put it on and walk out in public with it. And the thing she doesn't like about this sweatshirt is the way people look at me. They look at me, they look at the shirt, they turn away. It creates this awkward moment because grief is something that people don't like to talk about. It brings up emotions and feelings. And I say to my wife, that's exactly the point. And if you don't get anything else that I talk about tonight, I hope you understand that there will be a time in your life that God is going to ask you to talk about things that are very uncomfortable to people that don't want to hear them. He's going to call you to do this. It might not be about grief, it might be about other things, but God does that to us. He calls us to talk about things that are uncomfortable, to go into uncomfortable situations. There are many times when I deal with grief that I don't have the slightest idea what I'm going to say to somebody. I have no clue what to say to them in their worst, darkest moments. But that's the point. I go into those dark moments knowing and believing that God's going to be there with me to give me the words to support me through that. And this shirt is just a representation of that. This shirt, every time I go out in public. Last week we were out in Lancaster and I had it on. We went into a grocery store. My wife says, please don't wear that in the grocery store. I said, no, sorry, honey, I'm going to wear it in the grocery store. 3 different people in that grocery store came up to me and told me stories of their loss, of their grief. One had lost a brother to a fentanyl overdose. Another one had a daughter that had committed suicide. Another one was an older woman. They had been married for 50 years, and she told me about her husband dying. This was an invitation for them to speak and talk about their grief. This was an invitation that God wanted me to wear, and God wants you to wear invitations. He wants you to get out there in the world and share your stories and share what you're called to do. And it's not easy. There is a certain awkwardness to this, but that's just the way it is. I am a grief instructor. I am not a grief coach. I am not a grief counselor. I am a grief instructor. I teach people about grief. And I have a nonprofit called the Grief Ministry. And the Grief Ministry was created to educate and empower people to love their neighbor through their season of loss. Most of us are not very good at loving ourselves through our seasons of loss, much less our neighbors through our seasons of loss. Churches are not particularly good at loving their own members through their seasons of loss, but they're even worse at loving their neighbors who don't believe what they believe and who don't live the way they live. And Jesus wants us to go out there and love our neighbor. There's no prerequisites that you have to be wearing my emblem or my logo. Jesus wants us to love everyone. And loving your neighbor through their season of loss is something that's very powerful and that he's called me to. I'm going to be doing a little bit of Grief 101 tonight. The session that I would run for this would be an entire morning. It would take about 3 hours, and I'm going to be doing it in a half hour, for 35, 40 minutes. But I want to talk about my professional background. For my professional background, I was a police officer for 13 years, patrolman, sergeant, then chief of police. I was an ambulance driver for 20 years. I ran 1,500 ambulance calls, many of them very, very horrible scenes that I witnessed. I was a firefighter. I was a hospice volunteer for 6 years. And a hospice volunteer is somebody that stays and works with people when they are going through their end stage of life, when they have terminal cancer, when they're dying. And I was a volunteer that I would spend the last weeks with these people and be there with them, because as they got sicker and sicker, fewer and fewer people came to visit them because they couldn't see them that way. So I would go and visit and spend time with them. So I did that. So it was a tremendous opportunity for me to learn a little bit more about grief. Now, something that's important for me to share with you tonight is my loss resume. And I'm going to share my loss resume up until the time I was 14 years old. And this is how my loss resume sounds. My very first recollection of church, no other recollection before this, my first recollection of church was standing there watching our church burn to the ground. I was 5, turning 6 years old. It was in 1961. And I was standing there with my mother. They were crying. My mother was crying. The other women that I was standing there with were crying. And lightning had struck our church, and it burnt to the ground right in front of me. It was surreal. I mean, every single thing was destroyed. The walls caved in. And we were standing off at a distance, and I got to see this. That's still in my mind. That was horrible. 3 years later, right up here in Bird Street, here in Birdsboro, My best friend and my cousin Ricky, we were 8 years old at the time. We looked very much the same. We were all identical size, everything to us. Ricky started getting headaches, and the reason Ricky was getting headaches was because he developed a brain tumor. And within a year, that brain tumor took Ricky's life. And I watched my cousin that I loved and cared about very much, my best friend at that time, I watched him die of brain cancer. It was surreal. I went to church with Ricky. You know, he was my close friend, and here Ricky is dying. So now I'm turning 9 years old, and you think, okay, now things are going to get better. Then I turned 14 years old, and my father was a very active person in our church, and did a lot of things, everything involved with the church. One day he decided that he was in love with another woman. So he packed up, took all the money and all the bank accounts, and left. I came home from school, my mom said, your dad left today. I said, well, where did he go? She says, I don't know. But he took all the money with him. And he did take all the money with him. The next thing I would hear from my father was 32 years later, a note that said, your father died last night. He never called, never wrote, never communicated with me in any way, shape, or form. By the time I was 14, I knew a little bit about grief. I had the traumatic experience of watching my church that I loved and cared about burn down. I watched my best friend Ricky die from brain cancer, and I also had a parent that deserted me. Back in those days, divorce was not that common, but I can tell you abandonment was even less common, where a parent would just vanish and never come back and never communicate in any way, shape, or form. So I am not a stranger to grief, because grief is not just about death, it's about the loss of anything you love. And if you love something and you lose something, you're going to grieve. Now, we're going to get a little bit of education about this. Who taught you about your grief? Where did you get your grief education? Can anybody tell me? No hands? There are never any hands. There are never any hands in the audience, because for the most part, most of us learn our grief by watching our friends and family. We watch how they do it. And many times they don't do it well. But most of us do not have formal grief education. We did not actually take a class where we learned the basic fundamentals of what grief is all about. And it's essential. We need to do that, because if you don't know how to reconcile your grief, reconcile your loss, it's going to be a huge problem in your life. Grief is a natural and normal response to loss. You know, it's not something odd. It's something that happens. Grief is love's shadow. Grief's the dark side of love. Grief is the price we pay for love. That doesn't sound very nice, does it? Grief is the love tax. If you love and you lose, you will grieve. Boy, it's really quiet in here. It's like, wow, this guy's like a real motivational speaker. He's going to get us really cranked up. This is depressing, isn't it? When you hear about it, this all sounds so depressing. Grief is natural. There's a paradox to grief, and this is the paradox. If I could take away all the pain that you are currently experiencing from your loss experience, if you're having one, if I could just wipe it away, would you want me to do it? I asked that question, the very first question in our grief support groups, and they say, yes, take away the pain. I don't want to put up with this pain. And I say, the only way that I could do that is if I removed every memory, recollection, experience that you ever had with that individual. If I took that, wiped them from your brain, then your grief would be gone. But they're saying, no, I don't want that. I don't want to forget the church where I grew up in. I don't want to forget my cousin Ricky. I don't want to forget the good times I had with my dad. I don't want to give all that up. But the only way I could get rid of my grief is to do that. So the paradox is, the very thing that will take away my grief are the things that I will not give up, the things I will not do in that. So that's the reality of the paradox. The good news of the paradox is our grief could be overcome through a process called mourning. Mourning and grief are two different things. You'll say, well, I hear someone's grieving, I hear they're mourning, like it's the same thing. They're not the same thing. Grief is a noun. It's a person, a place, or a thing. Grief can be Grief the gorilla, and I didn't bring him along tonight, but I have actually a Grief the gorilla. Grief can be the dark night of the soul. Grief can be the wilderness. Grief can be those sort of things. But mourning is a process. Mourning is an action word. Mourning means that you need to do something. If you do not mourn, you can grieve forever. Grief lasts forever. That's really depressing, isn't it? Grief lasts forever? This guy, this is just going down, down. where's this guy going with this if grief lasts forever? Can anyone tell me why grief would last forever? Does anyone have any idea why it would last forever? Any clues? Well, we were better with the music games. Okay. Concept number one, we're going to talk about love. The reason grief would last forever is because it's memory-based. All of our grief is memory-based. I still remember the church burning. I still remember Ricky dying. I still remember the look of the empty lazy boy where my dad always sat when my mom said, your dad left. I still remember that. If I remember it, doesn't that mean that grief stays? Grief does stay, but the emotions associated with grief do not have to stay. It's the emotions that are associated with grief that don't have to stay, and that's what's important. If you learn how to properly mourn the losses in your life, you will not have to put up with the burden of grief. Learning how to mourn properly and authentically is what's important. Before you have to learn about grief, you have to learn about love, because grief is a part of love. If you look at this diagram up in front here, this is my diagram of love. This is what love looks like. When you first meet someone, you allow them into your heart, enter here, you trust them, and you allow them into your heart, and now you're happy. Love is wonderful. Love is blissful. Oh, I have a new friend. I have a new boyfriend. I have a new girlfriend. I have a new truck. I have a new whatever it is that I love. I allowed it into my heart. But when you allow something in your heart, now you're vulnerable. And when you're vulnerable and that vulnerability is violated, now you're hurt. Hurt is where grief begins. Hurt, the dark side of love, is what grief. Hurt and healing are the dark side of love. Now you're hurt. You can stay in hurt forever. There are people that I know that have spent their entire life in hurt. Something horrible has happened to them, and they've spent their entire life in hurt. But if they want to get out of hurt, there's no way to go backwards into happy. People try to go backwards into happy, and what do they do to go backwards into happy? They try to find things that will make them happy. Some of them will use drugs. Some of them will use other ways to artificially make themselves happy. It does not work. So to go through hurt, you have to make a sacrifice. That means, let's say a good friend of yours, just they broke your heart. They hurt you terribly. You trusted them. You gave them information. They made a fool out of you, and now you can't believe it. You are completely hurt. So you're going to have to sacrifice. What is a sacrifice? The sacrifice means I'm going to have to lay my pride down. I'm going to have to lay my pride down. That's step one, is laying your pride down. That's only the beginning of healing. After you lay your pride down, you're not going to get to hope until you go through forgiveness. What is forgiveness? Forgiveness is saying, I am not going to hold what you did against me. If you have someone that's hurt you and said, okay, I'm going to let this go, but I'm never going to forget it. I'm never going to forget it. That doesn't work. Forgiveness means we need to release what that is. We have to let that go. That will get us to hope. Hope isn't happy. Hope is just a place where you can see happy again. Because to get from to happy, you have to once again trust. This person that hurt you, you're going to need to trust them again. Now, there's certain circumstances say, wait a minute, I was really violated. I was really, damaged in that. So there's a little bit more discussion to that, but this is a simple way of looking at love. This is the relationship that God has with us. This is what happened with Adam and Eve. God trusted Adam and Eve. They were in garden. Everything was happy. And then suddenly there was sin, and now there was hurt. And once they were hurt, God knew there was only one way out of hurt. And what was that? That was sacrifice. Jesus Christ sacrificed for us and went all the way through the healing. And the healing is not complete until God forgives us completely, forgets the sins that we committed, and now we're available to hope, and the relationship of trust brings us back to happy. This is a story of God. This is a story of love. And this is also the story of grief. It's important to understand what grief really is. So there's 4 states of love: happy, hurt, healing, and hope. And the love has 4 disciplines: trust, vulnerability, sacrifice, and forgiveness. If you love someone and you don't learn how to trust, you don't know how to be vulnerable, you don't know how to make sacrifices, and you don't know how to forgive, then you don't know how to love. You can have whatever, you can call whatever this relationship is that you think that you have, but you don't have love unless you have those things. And if you want to understand what grief is, you have to first understand what love is. Because sometimes in life, people that we love the most will hurt us the most. That's a sad reality. The people that we love the most are going to hurt us the most. I love my dad more than I can describe. And when he did this to me, I was hurt more than I can describe. It tore my heart out of my chest. My heart was broken. And sometimes I'm not able to go through this whole love cycle with my dad because he was gone. He disappeared. He never came back. But I was able to go through that cycle with God. I was able to go through that cycle that I can stand up here and talk about it now. There was a time in my life where I couldn't even mention what happened with my dad. I would just freeze. I would lock up. I couldn't talk about it. But I learned to mourn. I learned to mourn. And mourning is what happens in healing. Between sacrifice and forgiveness, that's where mourning happens. Grief, I mentioned this before, grief is a noun. Grief the gorilla, the wilderness of grief, the love tax, the love shadow, it's a noun. Mourning is a verb, it's an action word. Mourning is what we do in response to the loss experiences that we have. There's something that's interesting about dealing with loss. Loss is like a carbohydrate. It becomes one of two things. When you experience loss in your life, it is either going to become freight or it's going to become fuel. Those are the only two things, not one or the other. It's not like, well, maybe it's become something else. Your losses in your life will either become freight and weigh you down, or they become fuel and propel you forward. Some of the most successful people in the world have stories of loss that are unimaginable. They are absolutely unimaginable what they've gone through. One of the richest guys in the city of Reading was a guy named Severin Fairman. He owned Baldwin Brass. He was a multi-millionaire. He was an amazing man. At 14 years old, when I was going through this horrible thing with my dad leaving us, he was thrown into Auschwitz. He was a Jew in Nazi Germany. He was actually in Poland when they took over Poland, and he went through the Nazi concentration camps. And he was a gentleman I got to know fairly well, and we would sit and talk about loss because not everyone wanted to talk about loss to him, but he would talk about loss, and he said, Randy, he said, your lost, most painful experience of life only become one or two things. They either become freight or they become fuel. And he used that for fuel to go on to have a very successful life. And God can help you take whatever this is that you're carrying, this burden that you think that you can't move forward with. It's like having 100 pounds of coal on your back and walking through your entire life with 100 pounds of coal on your back, and suddenly someone says, why didn't you ever use it for heat? Why didn't you use it for light? Why didn't you use it for energy? Oh, I carried this around my whole life and I did nothing with it? Do you mean I could have done something with that coal? Yes, you can do something with that coal. You can do something with this grief. There is literally no chance that you're going to go through life and not experience grief. There's only one way that that can happen. If you never love anything or anyone, you will never grieve. And if you never love anyone or anything, you haven't lived anyway. You can't live like that. So mourning is something you need to learn. It's an absolutely essential skill to learn. So we went through that. Concept number 2, what I must do, the action steps for mourning a loss. And we're going to go through these very quickly. See where I'm at, making sure I'm not running over our time here. 10 action steps for mourning. Learn to recognize what activities or actions are truly providing comfort, which are not merely distracting you from your loss. This is an important step to find healthy ways to be comforted. Exercise, walking in nature, listening to music, and many other things. We need to find a way to find comfort in our darkness. And there are healthy ways. There are ways that God will put opportunities in our path. For me, now I only went to age 14 of things that happened to me. I can go through a litany of losses that you don't have time to listen to. But what ended up happening to me was I ended up starting writing poetry. Wow, you're a poet? Yeah, I've written over 600 poems. And poems are my outlet for self-expression. They're a way that I find comfort. Community, finding a community of people who share lost experiences and can be helpful. When I was growing up as a kid, there weren't not a lot of the kids saying, hey, did your dad desert your family? No. There weren't other kids out there that had experienced that. It was difficult for me to find it, but we need to find community. If churches can do anything that's specifically productive for helping people struggle with loss, it's creating lost communities. And lost communities sometimes can happen in a youth group. Some of you share common losses. Some of you share common troubles. And this thing that we were talking about, like the young men's thing and talk about real stories, that's opportunities for you to come in there and just say, hey, I have this struggle, I have this trouble, I have this thing going on. But you need to find a community where you can share that with, because there's nothing worse than being out in the world and looking around and just thinking, the rest of the world just doesn't get it. The rest of the world just doesn't care. You need to find a community. Connection. You need to find people with like-kind losses that there may be a suicide in your family, loss of a parent, loss of a sibling, a cancer diagnosis, COVID losses, disabilities. If you have a disability, that is something to grieve. If you have if you have an addiction, that's something to grieve. Whatever it is you're struggling with, you need to find common ground with people that are equally interested in doing something about it. Companionship. Finding there's one or two people with whom you can call anytime. They may be people in your youth group. Sometimes it's your youth group leader. Sometimes it's your pastor. You need to be able to have somebody who's going to connect and companion you with that. I had people that companioned me. I had people that God put into my path. As I look back now at the landscape of my life, and I see, I'm glad I didn't know what was coming ahead. When I was 6 years old, if someone said, these are all the things you're going to go through in your life, I'm glad I didn't know it. But now, as I'm looking backward over my life, I can see God's fingerprints all over the place. God was there for me again and again and again, and putting people in my path. I had to open my eyes and see them. I had to have the courage to approach them. I needed that companionship. Classroom. Taking the time to learn the philosophies of love, loss, grief, mourning. What I'm teaching here may not be the most exciting thing in the world to you, but I can tell you, there's this belief many times amongst people that I have to be the most successful person in the world. I don't care how successful you are. I rank people not by their ability to succeed, but by their ability to overcome failure, overcome adversity. Because there's a lot of people in life that could have been very successful, but it was their inability to overcome adversity. It was their inability to mourn their losses that worked against them. Counseling. Don't be too proud to seek counseling, whether it's in school or going to a professional counselor. If your parents talk to you about going to professional counseling, counseling is helpful. I went to counseling. I went to counseling as a teenager. I went to counseling as a young adult, and I went to counseling later in life. Why would I go to counseling as a young adult? When my wife and I decided that we were going to get married, I met this beautiful woman, and we're going to get married, and we were probably about 4 or 5 months out from the wedding, and I came to her and said, I don't know if I can do this. What? What do you mean? You asked me to marry you. What do you mean you don't think you can do this? Why did I think I couldn't do this? Because suddenly I didn't want to be vulnerable again. I didn't want somebody in my heart that was going to tear my heart out the way my dad did. Suddenly, all of this unreconciled loss from my past that I hadn't mourned was now rearing its ugly head and coming back at me. And I needed to go for counseling for that. Fortunately, I got counseling, and I married my wife, and we're married 42 and a half years now. I am so thankful that I got counseling. Don't ever underestimate what counseling can do. Then there's coaching. Counseling helps you with your past. Coaches help you, how can I plan the future? Who can help me go from step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4 to get through life? Who can be my coach to propel me forward? And coaching is important. Creativity. The arts offer an abstract outlet for self-expression. One of the greatest things in the Assemblies of God Church is fine arts. The fine arts program is spectacular. It's spectacular because it gives kids an opportunity to go out there and really showcase the talents that God has given them. Your worship band tonight, phenomenal. It's excellent. Being up here and just showcasing your talents. guess what? I wasn't musically inclined. I can't sing, I can't dance, I can't play an instrument, I can't do anything. I didn't even know that I could write poetry. But now I do write poetry, and that was the gift that God had given me. God's given every one of you a gift. You may not have found it yet. You may not even believe you have it yet. He's given each one of you a gift. I've gone to fine arts on the local level, on the state level, and the national level. And I have seen kids perform at the Assemblies of God's fine arts, and I hear story after story after story of these kids saying, I never even knew I had that in me. But creativity is important when you're dealing with grief. Confrontation. We need to confront the obstacles that are in front of us. If it was hard for me to drive past my grandparents' place where Ricky died. After he died, it's just like going to my grandmother took care of him until he died because my aunt just couldn't deal with it. So my grandmother took care of Ricky until he died. I couldn't even stand to get in the house. I would get the shakes. I would get all worked up because I couldn't go there. We need to confront that stuff. Eventually I could. Eventually I could go to the house. I could see the room he was in. I could see where I saw him for the last time. We need to confront the things that we think that we can't confront. And sometimes we can't confront these things in the natural. Sometimes we need God to help us confront them. Many times we do. And committing to your core beliefs. What is it that you believe? What is it that you believe in good times, in bad times, believing even when it's hard to believe? This is having true faith. Concept number 3, the parable of the rich man's ring. And unfortunately, I didn't bring that with me tonight. But I'm going to give you a version of what the parable of the rich man's ring is all about. Once upon a time, there was a poor man sitting in a park. He had nothing. He was dressed in old, torn clothing. Suddenly, a very rich man approached him and says, I have something for you. And the poor man says, well, why would you give it to me? He said, this is a gift for you. So he hands him this most beautiful, spectacular ring he's ever seen in his entire life. He hands him the ring, and he says, here, this is yours. And the poor man says, I've done nothing to deserve this. I can't afford this. And the rich man says, it's yours. I'm giving it to you. So he does. The poor man is still concerned, and he says, what if someone steals this? What if I lose it? I can't repay you. I don't want the responsibility of this. The rich man said, whatever happens to that ring is my business alone. Even if someone steals it, that's my business alone. I'm not going to hold it against you. And that was what the rich man's position was. But the rich man said, I have to tell you something. The day is going to come when I'm, maybe soon, maybe later, I'm going to come and I'm going to ask you for that ring back. And when I ask you for that ring back, I don't want there be any argument because that ring belongs to me. And the poor man says, okay, I can do that. So the poor man started enjoying the ring. Everyone in town saw the ring. He shared it and showed it with everybody. It became his identity. This beautiful ring was the poor man's identity. Suddenly, one day, the poor man was sitting on the bench, and the rich man came back. And he says, I see the beautiful ring there on your finger. I've come to claim it. The poor man's heart was broken. The end. That's a weird way to end, isn't it? That's an odd, abrupt ending to that story. Well, let's take a look at some of the questions. What was the origin of the beautiful ring? The rich man. Who was and still is the rightful owner of the beautiful ring? The rich man. The rich man owned it all along. That's important to understand. What obligation did the poor man have while possessing a ring? To enjoy it, to share its beauty with other people. That's the only obligation that he had. Offense. What offense could the poor man claim against anyone who stole the ring? It wasn't the poor man's ring. He couldn't even go to court to a judge and say, I want anything done about this because the poor man didn't even own the ring. He had no right to offense. What did the poor man owe the rich man in return for the ring? Nothing. Nothing other than gratitude. And finally, outcome. How will the poor man's response affect his relationship with the rich man? That's the question. Who's the rich man? God. Do you have anything in your life that belongs to you? If you are a Bible-believing Christian, the answer is no. There is nothing that you own or possess that belongs to you. Everything good comes from God and belongs to God, and anything that happens to that is God's business alone. But when we come and deal with grief, we look at this differently. When someone takes something that we think belongs to us, we have a spirit of offense. Do we give enough gratitude to the rich man? I know I don't. Sometimes I look, oh, look, I've done this or I've done that, or I have this wonderful thing. It all belongs to the rich man. Everything that you, from this point in your life, that you ever acquire will always belong to the rich man. Always belong to the rich man. Why is this concept important? Because not everyone believes in God. When you're helping people out there that are struggling with grief, not everyone believes in God. Not everyone believes in the rich man. Not everyone believes that what they have doesn't belong to them. And dealing with people in grief and understanding people in grief, when you're dealing with non-believers, people will ask me, do Christians hurt more than non-Christians? No, Christians and non-Christians hurt the same. If a Christian and a non-Christian both lose a mother that they love dearly, they're both going to hurt the same. But the non-Christian has a different perspective. The non-Christian's core belief said, I was blessed to have my mother, but my mother always came from God, belonged to God. I had the opportunity to enjoy her. I have no offense for anyone should she pass, and all I owe is gratitude. You have to understand, your core beliefs are going to determine how you look at the losses in your life. All the losses that happen to you in your life, all of the difficult things you go through are either looked through the lens of belief or they'll look through the lens of non-belief. Grief looks differently through the lens of non-belief than it does through the lens of belief. I'm not saying it's any less painful. Did Jesus have less pain than the thief on the cross? Did he suffer less? No, they both had the same physical pain. They both had enough pain that it actually destroyed them, that it killed them biologically at the moment. But his ability to get beyond that was the difference. That is the difference when we're dealing with grief. So those things are very important to understand. So finally, we're going to apply this to some of the questions. These are some questions that were shared with me that I wanted to speak about. The first question, how do I deal with the death that took place over 2 years ago? I was talking about a death that happened 60 years ago. I was talking about a death that happened 60 years ago. The loss that you've experienced, the death that happened 2 years ago, you're going to remember 4 years from now, you're going to remember 10 years from now, you're going to remember 24 years from now. But the pain associated with that loss does not need to continue with your remembrance. I no longer crumble in pain talking about Ricky dying or the church burning or my dad leaving, just as you do not have to carry that with you. The question is, how do I deal with the death that took place 2 years ago? The correct answer is mourning. You need to learn how to mourn the loss. Mourning is important. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. It doesn't say blessed are those who grieve, so they will be comforted. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are those who move through their loss, who go through the process. How do I know if I am struggling with grief? How do you know if you're struggling with grief? If you've had a loss, and I come up to you and ask you, I hear your dad died, no, I can't talk about it. I can't go there. If it's a landmine and you can't go there, you're struggling with grief. If something has happened in your life that you can't talk about without having an emotional response, then you're struggling with it. And it's okay to struggle. It's okay to acknowledge that I have emotions that I can't control related to a loss. But again, you're going to have to know that. So the presence of emotions to an experience means that you're struggling with it. And if you're struggling with it, then you have to do some of the things I talked about earlier. How do I let go of old pain? Well, this whole idea of how do I let go of old pain? What does it mean to let go of old pain? you're not going to you can't just get rid of the pain. Pain doesn't just disappear. Pain means that I'm going to have to deal with the emotions related to the loss. I'm going to have to confront some of my fears, some of my insecurities, some of my love. I don't know how to be vulnerable. I don't know how to sacrifice. I don't know how to forgive. If you want to know how you're going to deal with old pain, it's through the disciplines of love. You're going to learn how to be vulnerable, how to sacrifice, how to forgive, and how to trust again. And then after you trust again, you're going to be vulnerable, and then you're going to be hurt, and then and it goes around and around and around and around. It doesn't stop. But the more that it happens, the stronger you become. How can parents help me through grief? The way that parents can help you through grief is taking grief education, is learning what grief really is. Just because something feels good doesn't mean it is good. Just because something feels bad doesn't mean it is bad. That's very good wisdom to understand. Not everything that feels good in life is good for you, and not everything that feels bad in life is bad for you. Learning that wisdom, learning what that means is important. I don't think that all of the things that happened to me up to age 14 were good. And believe me, the things that I experienced on police and fire and ambulance, I have nightmarish situations that I can pick in my mind. There is not a single way that I can drive from my house to Abundant Life Church without passing at least a dozen fatal accident scenes that I was at personally. A dozen scenes that I remember, a car wrapped around that tree that was flipped upside down the road here. That was, I can't even get here without doing that. If I carried all of the emotion that was involved with every one of those things, and I did not know how to reconcile and mourn those losses, I would be out of my mind. You need to learn how to mourn. So parents can help their kids by learning about grief and understanding what this is about. How do I deal with feeling I'm not good enough and losing friendships? When you're not feeling good enough and you're losing friendships, when you're not feeling good about yourself, there's a problem with you understanding how do you love yourself. Understanding how does God love you and how do I love myself. We want to be lovable. We want the world to love us, but we don't spend enough time learning how we can love ourselves and how we can allow God to love us and how God will forgive us and this relationship. We're right back to the love diagram. When you say, how do I deal with not feeling like I'm not good enough and losing friendships, that all has to do with your capacity to love. We all have the capacity to love, and learning about love is important. What's the best way to deal with grief? The best way to deal with grief is to let grief happen. What? To let grief happen. What happened has happened. And then we're going to have to say, now that I've accepted that what has happened, now you're going to have to mourn the loss. What are the things that I can do to mourn the loss? And that's important. Should I talk to my parents about my struggles even if it's uncomfortable? Yeah, that's what the grief sweatshirt's all about. Grief is uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable going to your parents talking about things that you don't even know how to express in words. And you think that they're not even going to understand. There's something that you need to know about your parents. They have grief and loss that they're carrying around that you know nothing about. Your parents have had losses, painful losses in their life that you know nothing about. They have experience at things that you know nothing about. And when you share a loss experience with them, that you can't say, well, they never dealt with this and they never dealt with that. Maybe they didn't deal with that exact thing, but they might have dealt with things that are 10 times worse. And as you grow and mature and you allow your hurts out to them, that's an invitation for them to let their hurts out to you. There were things that happened in my mother's life that I did not have any idea about until after my dad left. And after my dad left, it opened up a conversation between me and her. There was no closer relationship than I could have with my mother when we were completely honest with each other about how we were feeling and what she had been through and what she was going through. Being honest with your parents is something that is essential. Some of us don't have the opportunity. I didn't have a father that I could go to. I had a grandfather that lived across the street that I went to, and he was somebody I could talk to. But, how do I talk to my parents? If your parents aren't willing to talk to you, then find someone who is. Because I'll guarantee there's always someone in this church that wants to hear your story and cares. There's no chance that there isn't someone in this church that wants to hear your story and care about it. How long should you grieve after someone dies? As long as you remember it. You will grieve as long as you remember it. You will not have as much pain through the rest of your life, because if you mourn it, you will not carry the pain, but you will grieve. I still grieve the church burning. I still grieve Ricky dying. I still grieve my dad leaving. How do I forgive someone who has hurt me in the past? Forgiveness is by far the most difficult of all the love disciplines. Forgiveness is the most unnatural thing in the world. We have a natural built-in self-defense mechanism that says, fool me once, shame on me, fool me twice, shame on you, okay? Or the other way around, actually. You understand what I'm saying. How do I forgive someone who's hurt me in the past? Forgiveness requires us to let it go. Sacrifice is what I do for you. Forgiveness is what I do for me. Forgiveness isn't for them. You have to get that through your head. Forgiveness isn't for them. The sacrifices I make are what I've done for you, but the forgivenesses that I have are for me. Because if I carry unforgiveness with me, I am carrying freight. Your loss either becomes one or two things, freight or fuel. Unforgiveness is freight that you cannot bear to carry through life. If I did not forgive my father, I would not be here speaking to you right now. If I did not forget, believe me, when I'm at an early age, I grew up in the church, and I'm thinking, okay, God's house burns down. Randy's best friend dies a horrible death of brain cancer, and Randy's dad leaves. Okay, what's wrong with that picture? Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. What? Does that make any sense in the natural? No. Do you think I didn't struggle with that? Sure, I struggled with that. But learning how to forgive, sometimes meaning understanding that even with God, we have to say, this forgiveness of me having offense against God, I'm not letting go of that as a favor to God. I'm letting go as a favor to me, because my relationship with God doesn't go on if I don't forgive him. My relationship with everybody else doesn't go on, and especially myself. Carrying that freighter fuel, that comes from carrying unforgiveness. Is it still okay to hurt about something someone has done, even if they are gone? Is it okay to still hurt about something someone has done if they are still gone? Sure, it's okay to hurt. You hurt because you hurt. If someone has hurt you in the past, even if they've passed away and they've died, my dad hurt me and he was gone for 32 years and then he died. Is it okay to hurt? Sure, it's okay to hurt. It's a natural response to hurt. It would be weird if you didn't hurt. If someone did something horrible to you, you say, oh no, I don't hurt. You're lying to yourself, you're lying to everyone else. It's okay to hurt, but it's not okay to not do anything about the hurt. It's okay to hurt, but it's not okay not to do anything about the hurt. To carry that hurt with you and do nothing about it is a mistake. It's a mistake, it's a mistake. When I was in the fire company, right after I joined the fire company, I was 17 years old. And a girl that I knew very well was going down a hill, and she fell off her bicycle, and a car came over and just ran right over her. It was horrible. It was horrific. The girl that died was an only child. Her mother is still alive. Her mother is as bitter today as she was the day of that accident, and that is now 50 years ago. She's as bitter today as she was then. She has led her entire life with a hardened heart, and the hardened heart is something that you have to understand. You have to understand the human heart is designed to be broken. It just isn't intended to stay that way. Are there layers to grief? Does it go away or just lessen? There aren't layers to grief, but grief does lessen. Grief doesn't lessen because grief goes away. Grief lessens because the emotions associated with the loss diminish because of your mourning. And again, this is way too, condensing this into this short period of time is, very difficult. But you have to understand that mourning is the answer. Learning how to mourn your losses is important. So those are the last of the questions that were up here. Does anyone have any other questions now about grief or loss or anything that you want to ask about? Parents? Parents, do you feel fully equipped to talk with your kids about loss and grief? Is that uncomfortable? Do your kids know everything about the losses in your life? No. I got 100% no's over there. You don't know everything about the losses in their lives. And guess what? They don't know everything about the losses in your lives either. They don't know every hurt, every pain, everything, every question, every self-doubt you have about yourself. They don't know that either. It's about communicating. It's about you sharing and being honest with them, about them sharing and being honest with you. And you know what that requires? That requires vulnerability. That requires vulnerability. And sometimes when you're vulnerable like that, you get hurt. And then you got to sacrifice. I'm running out of air here. So does anyone else has any other questions? Any other comments? Pastor Scott, do you have any thoughts?
Can we all just give Randy a round of applause? Brother, I could listen to you talk all day. I really could. Every time you speak, you just right to my heart, man. The Lord has anointed you for this ministry, and I just want to thank you so much for coming out and speaking to them, because honestly, even if it was just me who benefited from tonight, it would be enough. But I know everybody in here. I've seen kids taking copious notes, and so, again, thank you so much. I'm going to just address them for a little bit, because the Lord was putting some things on my heart that I want to share with you guys, because he was talking about so many real things, and I just want you guys to understand that is, he absolutely nailed the ending with, this is why we had tonight. It's communication. If you keep these things locked inside, nothing will ever change. The way you feel now is how you will feel in 50 years. Parents, it is imperative that we understand we are teaching our kids, whether you know it or not, whether you mean it or not. They are learning from you. And if you are like me, who shut down and go into a shell when things get tough, I don't want to pass that on to Isabella. I don't want her to deal, I want her to be able to deal with her emotions. So I'm having to learn how to deal with grief and how to understand these things. I'm going back to school at 32 years old because I want to show her there's a better way. And I just want to encourage each and every one of you, please, Randy offers classes. If you have any questions of how to get in touch with him, see him later tonight or reach out to me. I think it's a great idea. Young people, if you want to go through these classes, if you're like Pastor Scott, we need to understand this more. I need you to bring him back so he can dive deeper into this. Dude, let me know. Okay, I can talk to you about this. I can make sure we get in touch with him. We can bring him out for an entire series one month. I want, this is something that is so important and plaguing our young people like never before. But I just want you guys to understand, how do I apply this to my life? There's no way that I can apply this other than with parents and children. When Randy was speaking, the Lord was showing me, this is exactly what I'm going through with you. Seniors, you have hurt me deeply by graduating. It's serious, and I know it's funny, but I'm really hurt and I'm really struggling. I'm on the dark side of love right now because my seniors, parents, if you didn't know this, these are the ones I started with. I was not a pastor before this. These seniors were my youngest kids in our group when I answered the call, and I was, for the first time in my life, vulnerable like never before. I picked up a mic it was at the community center. So I stood up in a room and yelled Bible things at kids. For the first time, I had to speak in public. For the first time, I had to read in front of people. I have never been more vulnerable in my life. And through that vulnerability, I created love for you. God has used you in my life just as much as he's used me in yours. We became friends. I was your mentors. I love you so much. But now you're being pulled away from me. And I am extremely hurt. And I'm struggling to forgive you for it. I'm struggling to understand it. I'm struggling just to process it. But you were never mine to hold on to. Randy's right. You are a gift from God, and I need to be thankful to him for what he has done in my life through you. I need to realize that the memories we share is the reward. And I need to understand that there's hope. If I can understand that I can process and get to forgiveness and realize that it's just the tip of the iceberg for you young people. I can't wait to see what God does. There's hope on the horizon. And it gets me to the heart of, I can do this with the next one. I can trust my freshmen this year that God will use you just as powerfully in my life and vice versa, and that I can start this whole nonsense over again. You can apply these principles to all areas of your lives. And I just want you to understand, if you're struggling, you will stay there if we don't start a conversation. It can be awkward. It can be, well, I can't talk to my son or daughter about sex, and I can't talk about the sins that young people are going through. Why? Did Jesus not call out the woman at the well for having more than one husband, and the man you're living with now is not him? Did he not just lay it out on the table and say, listen, this is going to be uncomfortable, it's going to be awkward, but let's talk about it, because it needs to be in the light. It's what we need to do. Start the conversation. You guys have to be willing to start the conversation, especially if you have an authority that doesn't believe in God. You can't expect them to figure this out. Start the conversations. And like Randy said, find somebody, find community. That's what our group is for. Find people who struggle with the things. Come to me. I will help you. I will talk with you. I love when you guys ask me, hey, Pastor Scott, I don't know what mom and dad are going to say. Tell me, and then I'll help you tell them. We'll come up with a plan together. I'll sit down with you. I'll sit with them if you want. I don't care. I just want it talked about. I'll help you in any way that I can. And usually after we talk, you're like, no, I got this. I can share this now. I feel comfortable. I feel like I'm prepared. That's perfect. But it all started with one share. And usually it's between you guys. It's between friends. And then that share, they bring you to me. And then I bring you to them. However God uses it. But you got to be honest with yourselves. If you're struggling, tell someone, please. Because we can't go through this cycle by ourselves. And I encourage you, Randy, I really want to get that love diagram, and I want to just make a poster and put it up in the torch room so that we can look at that every week. And if you ever need it, if you guys want any of the notes or anything, please, again, reach out, because I would love to give you that information. But I hope it was insightful for you as it was for me, and you've given me a lot to think about tonight and a lot to process, and I just feel very hopeful for the future and with the relationships in my life, because a lot of them need evaluating. And I just love your heart, brother, and again, I love you so much and what the Lord's doing in your life. Father, I just thank you for tonight. I thank you so much for Randy, Lord. And I just pray a special blessing upon him and his family. Lord, that you would just continue to use his tragedies and his stories as testimonies for the kingdom of God. Lord, it's one of my favorite things that Joseph said to his brothers, what you intended for evil, God intended for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Lord, I thank you that you are such a good God that you can overcome grief. Not even just overcoming it, but God, you can take our darkest moments, you can take our most painful experiences, and then, Lord, you can use that very thing that caused us pain to propel us forward into a better understanding of you, a better relationship with you, and also to use it for the glory of God. So now what hurt us is being the number one thing we use for the kingdom of heaven. Father, I just thank you that I will never understand how good you are and what you are truly capable of. And so, Father, I just pray over every young person. I pray over every parent who's listening to this, Lord, that they would humble themselves and be able to look inward at their lives and say, what am I struggling with? What am I grieving? What grief do I have that is undealt with? What do I have that needs my attention? Because, Father, I truly believe that you have called us to get our hearts right first with you, to deal with our issues first so that we can better help others. And Father, I just pray that you would use this series, that you would use this YouTube video, Lord, to spark conversations, to trigger this process. And Lord, that we would finally understand the cycle of grief, and that we would participate, that we would apply it to our lives. And so, Father, I thank you so much for your love and your forgiveness and your guidance. It's in your name that we pray. Amen.